Hello, Q Baptist Zoom Church. I'm here in the church building for those of you that have been here before, and it's freezing. Fog and mist were coming out of my mouth. Over the past few weeks, we've been looking at a series, Cultivating Hope in Uncertain Times. And we've seen how the Apostle Peter reminds the Christian community of their identity, of their value, of their worth because of what Jesus has done for them. We saw in chapter 1 how we've been given new birth, a living hope, an inheritance in heaven that can never perish or spoil or fade, that we can live beautiful and holy lives in reflection of the beauty and holiness of our God. And last week, Lauren shared with us around those claims that Peter makes in chapter 2, where he says in verse 9, "You are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light." But now in this next part of the letter, chapter 2, verses 11 to 25, Peter makes a shift from who we are, our identity, to what it means to live out this faith in practical and daily living. How to be good, how to do good, living good lives. And N.T. Wright says this about the shift at this point in Peter's letter. After the breathtaking vision of the opening verses of chapter 2, this passage has something of the feeling of blinking, rubbing our eyes and saying in effect, all right, this is who we are now, so what are the priorities? How are we going to behave? How do we live within this world? Right away, Peter gets to business. So once you've understood who you really are within God's great world-changing purposes, it's vital that you learn to live appropriately. So let's look at the text, and I encourage you to have a Bible at hand. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 11 to 15 says, "Dear friends, I urge you, as foreigners and exiles, to abstain from sinful desires which war against your soul. Live such good lives among the pagans that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day that he visits us." Now, the thing to note here is that Peter reminds the believers, the Christians who are under external persecution and threat, they actually have an internal enemy, a threat from within, and that is their own sinful desires. Think of it like the concept of the fifth column or a spy in a war or battle situation between two nations. The fifth column is the spy or the traitor within the other nation, your enemy, or within your own nation, that works to harm you from within, to get information back to the other nation, to do damage from within. So Peter says to the church, yes, you're being persecuted outwardly, but you also have this internal potential for destruction. And he uses military language to guard against these desires which war against your soul. And Peter reminds the Christians that we still have sinful desires. We still are tempted. We still feel things and think things and even do things that we ought not think, feel, or do. Now, we don't need to feel condemned or guilty that we have feelings, that we are tempted, sinful thoughts. As Martin Luther, the great reformer, said, you can't stop the birds from flying around your head, but you can stop them from landing in your hair and making a nest. And what he meant was that thoughts and feelings and things come from sometimes the enemy outside, spiritual enemies, sometimes our own desires and internal conflicts. And we can shoo them away. We don't have to meditate on them. We don't have to cultivate those sinful thoughts or feelings. We can offer our prayer up to God, being honest and saying, Lord, help me. I don't want to think like this. I don't want to feel like this. Please help me, God. Give me a new spirit, a new heart, new affections to do and live like Jesus lived. Help me, Lord. So Peter says, don't be surprised, but don't give in to these sinful desires. And then in verse 13, he addresses the outward threat that the church is facing, the persecution, the dominating political powers of the day. And he writes, submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human authority, whether to the emperor as the supreme authority, or to governors who are sent by him to punish those who do wrong and commend those who do right. Now, people in Peter's day did not get to vote their leaders out every few years like we can, or vote them in. You were stuck with your leaders no matter how bad they were, how incompetent they were. Peter simply notes that ultimate authority, that authority and order and governance are God's mandate for creation. The alternative is anarchy and chaos. Now, that's not to say that Peter is telling the church that they have to go along with wicked policies or evil actions of political leaders, but we need to seek as much as possible to live in peace, to submit to the laws of the land, do what's right, don't cause unnecessary trouble, don't rebel against God-given authority, and to know that God himself will hold all leaders accountable. He will bring them into account and judgment ultimately. And it's at this point in the letter that Peter uses 4 or 5 times the phrase for doing good, for doing what is right. And this becomes a major theme of this section. So I want us to look at what that call to doing good looks like for followers of Jesus. And ultimately, I think it's Peter's way of saying, live like Jesus, do good, live good lives. So the first thing that we can note is that living good lives is evangelistic. It silences the enemies of Christianity and reveals the truth of Jesus to the wider culture. In chapter 2, verse 12, Peter says, "Live such good lives among the pagans, that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us." That our good deeds can be evangelistic, that people will turn to God as they see us live out the Christian life in all of its goodness and beauty. Secondly, living good lives, doing good, models citizenship, contributes to the common good, and can bring favour from secular authorities. So Peter says in verse 13 to 15, "Submit yourselves to the Lord, for the Lord's sake, to every human authority, whether to the emperor, the supreme authority, those who are sent to punish him, to commend those who do right." Again, being good, doing good is a way of expressing the value and the worth of the Christian faith to the wider culture. Thirdly, Peter says, doing good disarms arguments and mockery of Christianity. Actions speak louder than words effectively. He says in verse 15, "It is God's will that by doing good you should silence the ignorant talk of foolish people." And fourthly, Peter says, doing good, even when it is costly, especially when it is costly, enables us to identify and emulate the example of Jesus. He writes in verse 20 and 21, "But if you suffer for doing good and you endure it, this is commendable before God. To this you were called, because Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps." So there's a bit of a framework of doing good. But in that, I just want to touch on slavery briefly, which Peter mentions in verse 18. He said, "Slaves, in reverent fear of God, submit yourselves to your masters, not only to those who are good and considerate, but to those who are harsh." And this seems harsh advice in many ways. But understand, as one writer has said about slavery, that in the ancient Greco-Roman culture, many people were legally owned as property by others. Slavery was located in the context of the extended household, where the father exercised total legal control over enslaved members of his household. The quality of daily living for slaves depended on the quality of the head of the household, including workload, corporal punishment, and abuse. Slaves were the basic labour force of the imperial or Roman economy. We must not impose our knowledge of slavery as practiced in the New World in the 17th through 19th centuries, because slavery in the ancient world differed in that racial factors played no role, education of slaves was greatly encouraged, and many slaves held high responsible roles, and most urban and domestic slaves would anticipate being set free by the age of 30. Still a harsh life, but not the slavery that we normally think about when we think about that word. Now, back to doing good and being good. It's clear that people with no faith, different faiths, all sorts of faith, do good things. And being good and doing good is not just the sole domain of the Christian person. And we see this in the Bible, where Jesus says that those who are not against him are for him. But for Christians, doing good is not an end in itself. And it's not something that we congratulate ourselves over for being good people. We seek to do good because we serve a God who is good. Goodness is a quality and attribute of our God. Goodness comes from God. God is good. And we can commend and draw alongside those in our society who are doing good, who are doing God's work without even knowing it, and we can support them and encourage them and cheer them along. But Peter is saying, I think in this letter, in this section, to the church, that we should outshine and outperform the wider society in goodness. We should be the best good people around. I think it was Pastor Paul Pallett last year in one of his messages here at Kew Baptist. He put forward the idea that if you were taken to a law court and put on trial for being a Christian, would there be enough evidence to convict you of being a Christian? And I remember being convicted by that. And I know it's, in some ways, it's not just about what we believe as Christians, though it's good to have Bible and theological knowledge. It's not just what we say as Christians, though it's good to be able to speak plainly and clearly about Jesus. But it's so important what we do, how we live our lives. And Peter here reminds the church, you are holy, you are dearly loved, you are precious, you are God's special possession. Therefore, you have even more motivation, more power, more reasons to do good. Christians should be winning the goodness Olympics. And that's not a heavy burden or a guilt thing to put on us, but we can excel at goodness. And I would say do good because Jesus did good and makes you good. And this is how Peter finishes this section of the letter. When they hurled their insults at him, Jesus did not retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats. Instead, he entrusted himself to him who judges justly. He himself bore our sins in his body on the cross, that we might die to sins and live for righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed. For you were like sheep going astray, but now you've returned to the shepherd and overseer of your souls. Jesus makes bad people good, sinful people righteous, enslaved people free, broken people whole, and he finds lost people and brings them home. Look back on the previous week and reflect on where you have been good and done good. Where have you done good deeds? Where have you done what is right? Thank God for that grace and pray for more grace. Look ahead to the next week, to this coming week, and ask yourself, what good can I do? Every day, pray and say, Lord, what good can I do today? Help me do good deeds, Lord. Show me ways to be good and to do good. How can I excel in goodness? How can I be good? Show me, Lord. Help me bless others and serve others and to live a good life like Jesus, because he lived a good life. He lived a beautiful life and he did good things and he blessed others. Well, I want to hand back over to myself now in Zoom Church, and we're going to go into a time of discussion in some breakout rooms and some prayer together. And I'll give you a couple of questions when we come back to reflect on this section of Peter's letter on how we can be good and do good and excel in goodness. Thanks for listening, and God bless you.